If you've watched my last two videos, you'll start to pick up on a pattern with Peter Molyneux. When he is promoting a game, he will spare no detail, and his excitement for what he and his team are working on, combined with his great ability to describe and sell you on the proposed features, leads to a hype train that once he gets rolling, he is unable to stop. At this point, after Black and White and its expansion Creature Isle's release, there was little in the way of disappointment, and he met and even exceeded the wild expectations and hype, creating an ambitious and unique entry into the God game canon. With this wild success, there were expectations for Lionhead in their next games, and Lionhead had a unique plan for rapid expansion. They had opened several satellite studios so they could work on 6 new games at once. The most notable of these included Big Blue Box and their Project Ego, which would later become Fable, Black and White sequel, and a movie studio tycoon/simulator later to be called The Movies. But we're not here to talk about those games. Not yet, anyways. We're here to talk about the games that never made it out the door. The games whose failures range from nearly completed ports of Black and White to overly ambitious games about raising a tribe of prehistoric men, and lastly, a psychedelic shoot-'em-up created by one of gaming's most enigmatic figures, Jeff Minter. Welcome to the weird world of Lionhead's canceled games. If you recall from my video on Black and White, you'll remember in one of the slides that Peter Molyneux was showing at GDC that there were plans for ports of Black and White to essentially every console out then. And barring the Game Boy Color ports, that is true, and they're quite interesting considering how large and ambitious Black and White was. We'll start with what I find to be the most interesting of these, which is the PS1 port, which was developed by Chrysalis Studios, who had in those years specialized in PS1 ports of PC games. This port was almost completed before being cancelled too. It was a legitimate attempt to bring the full Black and White experience to the long obsolete PlayStation 1, with sacrifices, which is to be expected. Instead of 5 lands, it would feature 3, and far less quests going from 100 to 25, but the story and game structure remained intact, which is quite impressive. The creature is here, but with dumbed down AI, which could only handle limited knowledge of the game's items and world. The graphics and scale displayed are actually quite impressive for the console, and the miracles and weather effects are still intact. This is a fascinating piece of engineering that I wish I had a chance to play and compare to the original. There was also a Dreamcast port announced around the same time, with fewer details, which, considering how open Molyneux and Lionhead were, leads me to believe that they never got too far with this one. Sega pulling out of the hardware business was the most likely culprit. The limited info we did get from this comes from magazine ads that feature screenshots, a very old cover featuring the logo that was not final, and most interestingly, VMU support to allow your creatures to fight each other. These ports were interesting to me as they intended to bring the PC experience to weaker hardware, but these weren't the only attempts to bring Black and White to console. Black and White: The Next Generation, also known as Black and White Titan, was announced for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and would give the player direct control over the creature with no gods to be found. This is all according to a first look article written for GameSpot by Sam Parker. Your creature would cast miracles, impress villagers, fight other creatures, and the like. Instead of worshipping at a temple to charge miracles like the first game, villagers would worship the creature directly. Molyneux described this version to be similar to Pikmin, as you could send your following villagers to build and harvest at the press of a button. What I do find interesting is that they had planned to keep the creature's personality intact despite you being in direct control. According to Molyneux, this would manifest differently than, say, the creature wandering off like in the original, but would manifest in trampling villagers without your permission, which you would then have to correct that behavior. Titan would make some sacrifices in the graphics department as far as textures and model detail, but screenshots looked good, and the scalability of being able to see all the details of the land was intact. If the creature is on top of a high peak, you can make out everything due to the engine's view distance being infinite, even being able to see the villagers doing their rounds. Outside of this description, there is little in the way of relevant details or footage, but this version was quietly cancelled, never to see the light of day. Ports of pre-existing games are cool, but nothing's more juicy than a unique game that you never heard of before, right? Well, Intrepid Computer Entertainment was another Lionhead satellite studio, and their idea was a prehistoric action-adventure game where you would play as a tribe of prehistoric people in their quest to expand and become the top of the food chain in a brutal, dangerous world full of competition from dinosaurs and other more intelligent creatures. This game is pretty well documented through official and less official sources, so there's a good amount to dig through, but I'll try to keep this from dragging on too long. I'd really like to thank PtoPOnline for compiling all of the available gameplay footage and all his other work preserving gaming history, so I'll include a link down in the description to check out his channel if you find this stuff as interesting as I do. Anyway, let's break this down. As I said previously, the object of the game was to grow and migrate your tribe, so they had a better chance of survival. There were to be 6 levels. Each time you populate one, you take 5 of your best tribesmen and continue on to the next. Your tribesmen would have different classes and stats and uses like your standard hunter and mystic and chemist. Once you get to the 3rd world, you would eventually meet an enemy called the Simians, which is an intelligent species that are on your same level that finds you and wants to make you extinct. There are few examples of them being shown in any of the publicly available gameplay, but that was largely the goal. What is impressive and ahead of its time is its tech. It was to feature an open world with lots of foliage and animal NPCs to hunt, as well as dynamic weather and a variety of different biomes, including mountains, rainforests, underwater, volcanoes, blizzards, you name it. It's a bunch of stereotypes, but it feels right and it's not trying to be realistic. They wanted to emphasize how brutal the world would be in BC in a lot of their marketing spiel. The world was brutal, there was to be more blood and dismemberment in combat, there would be many ways to kill enemies with the deadly environment. Examples they used included using plants to poison enemies or triggering an avalanche with the interactive environment. The interactive environment would feature items you could pick up and use as weapons, or tools to get past obstacles like boulders and other things. Enemies would not be your standard cannon fodder, but would feature smarter AI than the average game at the time that would act independently of you and each other and would try to take advantage of straggling tribe members and protect their young if they thought they were in danger. In a GameSpot article on BC from the time, creatures that were higher on the food chain would attack those lower on the food chain, which they brought up as similar to the mechanics in Peter Jackson's King Kong game, which is a very surprisingly interesting game in its own right. A lot of these things may not sound that impressive, but you gotta realize that this was worked on in the early 2000s, and there weren't these huge crafting and survival games flooding the market, and this is kind of an early facsimile of that genre, which is very cool, but also makes sense why it never had a shot to make it. Quotes throughout its development always kind of poured cold water on its ability to really get out the door. There was give and take, like Molyneux saying the demo build was 50% done, but he wasn't sure when it could be released due to the high ambition and standards of the game and its developers. It kind of makes me think that something like this could have been complete if the early access model existed, because you see an interesting base here in the gameplay, and if they could drop a good chunk of it while continuing to get funding, it would have inspired more confidence in it getting completely finished long term. Not to say that that model always produces finished products. I'm looking at you, Goddess. All this ambition led to what was most likely inevitable, especially with the Satellite Studios model, and in late 2004, Molyneux announced that BC's production was canceled, stating, "The decision to suspend work on any games project is always a very difficult one, particularly when it is a title with the potential of BC." Resources were stretched too thin, and they needed to release a game sooner than later, and Fable, Black and White 2, and the movies were just much farther along and worth expending the limited resources that were going into BC. Now, the last canceled game I'll be covering here was called Unity, and its information is sparse, but of particular interest to me, almost like the universe was pandering to me specifically. Psychedelic vivid visual? Check. Shoot 'em up gameplay? Check. Jeff Minter solo developing? Check. A planned IDM soundtrack? Check. Now, Jeff Minter might not be a famous name to all of you, particularly Americans, because a lot of his games were developed for Sinclair's Z line of computers, and some of my favorites like Tempest 2000 were developed for the Atari Jaguar. His style is shoot 'em ups with psychedelic elements that are distinct and strange. Another good example of a game of his is Attack of the Mutant Camels. Most recently, though, he developed Polybius, the game based off of that old internet myth about a CIA-created MK Ultra game. Unity was to be more of the usual for Minter, with 2D and free-roam 3D sections reminiscent of Star Fox, with jellyfish-like enemies. The levels would be affected by the music playing on the fly due to being built on top of Minter's music visualizer technology, Neon. It looked like it could have been pretty fun, but it never made it out the door. And why that happened? Well, there's a few pieces of information floating around, but the one I buy into is that it was supposed to be a GameCube exclusive, but Minter being a solo developer was taking too long, and by the time there was real progress being made, Microsoft had swooped in and bought Lionhead. They really didn't look at Unity as something that really fit their plans for Lionhead or Xbox in general. A little totally unverified comment on the Unseen64 post about this game is that Minter might have wanted Aphex Twin to do the soundtrack, and if you're familiar with Richard James, you know he probably said no in the most snarky way possible. Another theory for who would have done the music is the British group Underworld. While the game would never be released, Minter ended up upgrading and expanding the visualizer technology used for it, and that would eventually become the visualizer on the Xbox 360, which I had used quite a bit back in the day. There's something about canceled games that will always fascinate me, especially when it comes from studios with such talented minds as Molyneux or Minter. You think of what could have been if it was just given more time and more resources. Oftentimes you'll get excited, and the rug being pulled from that hype makes you long for the experiences you were robbed of. A bad game that comes out is usually bad forever, but the game that you can't play could be anything. It could even be the greatest game of all time. The landscape back in this time was far more optimistic. Games could be anything. Dreams of what you're making could be shared without the insanely negative scrutiny of today. And we as a public have been burned too many times since then, and developers have learned that no news is good news until you have something real to show. The seeds that would grow the trees that feed the cynics of today would be planted by Molyneux with the next officially released game. One that most of you should be familiar with. I thank you for your time once again, and I'll see you in the next one.